everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and today we're going to be looking at how to play the 2 to 4 player game Dark.net, released by WizKids in the US. Dark.net comes with all of the components that you see here, including player components in each of the 4 player colors, 20 contacts, 5 in each of the 4 fence colors, 100 total information cubes, 25 in each fence color, 4 retaliation dice, 1 per fence color, a city board, 2 transmission dice and an attack die, 24 trace tokens, 24 destruction tokens, 16 response cards in level 1 and 2, and then 40 total network extensions, 10 in each of the fence colors. To begin setup, place the city board in the middle of the table. Randomly determine the player color by dealing out the player aid boards. We're playing a 2-player game, so we've dealt out 2. Next, give each player their starting network. You can tell a player's starting network because the back of the network tile will match the player color. So in this instance, this network tile would be dealt out to the black player, and this network tile would be dealt out to the white player. Make sure and set these tiles off to the side so there's plenty of room to expand your network later in the game. Each player will receive the following components to start the game. They will receive the 3 network boosters in their color, the 4 informants in their color. They will also receive a virus marker for each opponent in the game. Since we're only playing a 2-player game, each player will have 1 virus marker. Players also have 2 cubes in their player color to mark how much money they have in the game, or credits. The starting player will receive 1 credit. This can be marked by placing a cube in the 1 space. You can determine the player order by looking at the number on the back of each starting network tile. Whichever number is lower goes first in the game. So in our example, the black player has a 2 while the white player has a 3. So the black player gets to go first. Each other player will receive 1 more credit in turn order. So in our example, the white player will receive 2 credits. There's also a marker showing plus 50. This can be given to a player if they ever exceed 50 credits during the game. Each player will also receive 1 information cube in each of the fence colors. Next, roll the 4 retaliation dice and see what numbers show up. These rolls will determine how many information cubes start on each of the 4 fences. For instance, in the red example, there will be 3 information cubes placed on the track. When you're placing information cubes, you start at the top level and then place going down. After you're done, it should look like this. After this is done, place the remaining information cubes near the fences to form the common supply. Place some of the destruction tokens and the trace tokens near the play area to form a common supply as well. Next, separate each of the contacts by color. Then arrange them in a stack so that the highest valued contacts are on the bottom and the lowest valued contacts are on the top. After you've done this, place them in their designated space on the city board. After you're done, it should look like this. Next, shuffle all of the network extension tiles and place a small face-down stack onto the space designated on the board. You can randomize these tiles however you want to. I personally like to use a bag, but that's up to you. Also, you don't have to use the entire supply of network tiles whenever you're placing them in this area. Just use a few to get you started, and then if you need more, make sure to keep the rest of the supply close to refill this stack when necessary. After you've shuffled all the tiles and placed a supply in this designated space, turn over 4 network extension tiles to fill the display. Next, shuffle the level 1 and the level 2 response card stacks separately. Then, deal out a number of cards depending on the player count. In a 2-player game, we're going to pull out 5 level 1 cards and 4 level 2 cards. Place the level 2 cards on the bottom of the stack and the level 1 cards on the top of the stack to form a supply for the game. After you've done this, place these cards within easy reach of all players. Finally, make sure that the attack dice and the transmission dice are within reach of all players. After all of this has been done, you're ready to play. The start player will take the first turn, and then play will continue clockwise around the table. Each player's turn will consist of 3 phases: the transmission phase, the action phase, and the trace phase. After each player has completed all 3 phases, The next player in turn order will complete the 3 phases again. This will continue until the game end condition has been met. At the start of the transmission phase, the active player will roll the transmission dice. If a 7 is rolled, the players will suffer what the game calls a corporate attack. If anything else is rolled, the players have a chance to gain information. For instance, in our example, we rolled a 5. If a player has a network tile that matches what was rolled, they will gain 1 information cube of that color. It's important to note that every player at the table will gain rewards based on what's rolled in this phase, not just the active player. In our example, the black player has a blue network extension with the number 5, so they would gain 1 information cube of the network extension tile's color. Throughout the game, players will have the opportunity to place network boosters and informants at different places on their network. It's important to note that for each network booster or informant that is affecting a network extension tile, the reward will be increased by 1. For instance, this network booster will affect all 4 of these tiles because it's touching each of the 4 corners. This informant will affect both of these tiles because it's placed in between the 2 tiles on top of the line. So in this example, if a 5 had been rolled with these 2 pieces on the board, this player would receive 1 cube for the dice that's rolled, plus an additional 2 cubes of that color for these 2 extensions. If the transmission dice roll a 7, the players have to suffer a corporate attack. When players suffer a corporate attack, they have to roll the attack die. If the roll is blank, the players are safe and they don't have to destroy any of their network extensions. If, however, the die rolled a color, the players will have to destroy a network extension matching that color. So let's say, for instance, that this player rolled a blue on a corporate attack. Any of the players around the table that have a blue extension would have to place a destruction token on one of those extensions if they are able to. If a network extension already has a destruction token on it, it can't be destroyed again. And it's important to note that starting networks are safe. So for instance, any of these 4 networks can never suffer a corporate attack. And once again, it's important to note that all players are affected by this attack, not just the active player. Destroyed network extensions don't generate any information cubes, they only generate 1 credit. So let's say, for example, in a future round, a player rolled a 9 during the transmission phase. This red information tile would generate an information cube, just like it normally does, but this blue 9 would only generate 1 credit. The information would not be generated. If during the transmission phase, a destroyed tile's number is rolled, the players can spend credits equal to the tile's cost to remove the destruction token. So, since a player rolled this 9, and that matches the destroyed tile's number, the player could pay 4 credits from their supply, if they had it, to remove this destruction token. It's important to note that the player would not receive the credit from that destroyed tile first. They would either receive the credit and leave it destroyed, or pay the credits and remove the destruction token. It's also important to note that each time a corporate attack occurs, 1 trace token will be placed on each of the 4 fences. We'll explain what trace tokens do in a few minutes. Now that we've looked at the transmission phase, let's look at the action phase. On a player's turn, they'll take 2 actions. There are 8 possible actions that a player can take on their turn. Let's look at these actions in detail. The first action a player can take on their turn is to sell to a fence. To sell information to a fence, a player would take 1 of their available information cubes and sell that cube to the corresponding fence. So for instance, this player could take their yellow information cube and sell it to the yellow fence. When selling information to a fence, a player will receive credits equal to the highest showing value on that fence. It's important to note that the player will receive this price for all of the cubes that they sell. So for instance, if a player were selling 3 yellow cubes to this fence, they would receive 4 credits per cube for a total of 12. When gaining credits, players will adjust their cubes on the bunker bank. So for instance, after selling these cubes for 12 credits, this player would now have 13. They would mark that by placing 1 cube on the 10 and the other cube on the 3. After placing all of these cubes on the fence, the new sale value would be 3, since this is the highest showing number. It's also important to note that players can never sell more cubes than there are available spaces. So for instance, this fence only has room for 3 more cubes to sell. It's also important to note that a player may only sell to one fence per turn. Finally, after selling to a fence, if the retaliation die is still on that fence, the player will take the die and put it in their player area, and then place a trace token on that fence. The next action that a player can take is to buy from a fence. It's important to note that you can only buy from one fence in a turn, and you can't buy and sell with the same fence in a turn. When buying from a fence, you can buy any number of available cubes as long as you can afford them. The purchase price for cubes is the same price as the sale price. So for instance, on this fence, since the highest visible number is 2, each cube purchased would cost 2 credits. This player decides that they want to buy 3 cubes for 6 total credits. The player would take these cubes and put them in their supply, and then adjust their bunker bank accordingly. Finally, if the retaliation die is still on the fence when you take this action, you'll take this die and put it in your personal supply, and then place the trace token on that fence. The next action a player can take is to buy a network extension. To buy a network extension, the player would look at any of the available network extensions in the display, and then pay the cost shown on the bottom of the tile to purchase this tile. So for instance, if they wanted to, a player could spend 4 credits to buy this yellow extension. When a player purchases a network extension, they can place it in their network adjacent to any of their previous tiles. So for instance, this player could place this network extension here, or down here on any side of their network. They wouldn't be allowed to place it like this, however. After purchasing an extension, the player will draw a tile from the top of the stack to replace the one that was purchased. And finally, if the fence matching the purchased network extension's color still has its retaliation die, you'll take the die and place a trace token on that fence. It's important to note that before taking the network extension action, a player can empty the display if they wish. If a player wanted to, before taking the action, they could spend 2 credits to clear all of the extensions in the display. It's important to note that after refilling the display, the player is not required to buy one of the new tiles if they don't want to, but one of their 2 actions for the turn is still used by taking this action. The next action that a player can take on their turn is to make a contact. To make a contact, a player will pay the visible cube cost on one of the face-up contacts to purchase that tile. So for instance, the top contact in the green contact stack shows a cost of 3 cubes. The player could pay these 3 information cubes to the supply, and then take this contact from the top of the stack and place it in their player area. A player can only make 1 contact per turn, and can have a maximum of 5 contacts. Finally, if the fence matching the contact's color still has its retaliation die, take the retaliation die, place it in your supply, and then place a trace token on that fence. Having contacts will give players points at the end of the game, but contacts can also be flipped over to be used for special additional actions. At any point on their turn, a player can turn over a contact using it for a special ability. These abilities can be used at any time during the action phase on your turn, and they don't count as one of your actions. Using a contact will allow you to do a number of different things. Using a contact will allow you to remove a destruction token from a tile in your network that matches the contact's color. So if a player wanted to on their turn, they could flip over this green contact and then remove the destruction token from this green tile in their network. They can do this because the contact's color matches the network extension. There's another type of disk that can be placed on your networks by your opponent called a virus. We'll look at how to install a virus in a moment, but it's important to quickly note that if you use a contact, you can neutralize a virus similar to removing a destruction token. If the player had instead flipped the green contact to neutralize this virus, they would simply turn it over on its opposite side, showing that the virus is neutralized. After using the contact to do this, this virus would no longer be in effect. The last thing that using a contact could do is allow a player to exchange cubes 2 to 1. So for instance, if this player flipped a green contact over, they would be able to exchange green cubes at a 2 to 1 ratio to get cubes of any other color. The next action that a player can take on their turn is to hire an informant. Each player color will have a different cost for hiring an informant. For the black player, this cost is 2 red and 2 green information cubes. Only 1 informant can be hired per turn. To hire an informant, a player would pay the information cube showing on the informant's cost back to the supply. An informant can be placed on a border between 2 network tiles in your network. So for instance, a player could place an informant in between these two tiles or in between these two tiles. The only restriction is that a player is not allowed to place an informant where there already is an informant, and a player can't place an informant in a way that would cause it to hang off of one tile. The next action that can be taken on a player's turn would be to install a network booster. Only one network booster could be installed in a turn, and each player will have different costs to play a network booster, just like with the informant. For the black player, a cost to install a network booster is 3 yellow and 3 blue cubes. The player would first pay these cubes to the general supply, and then they would be able to take the action. After paying the information cost to the supply, the player would then place their network booster at an intersection of 4 different network tiles in their network. So for instance, the player could place it at this intersection here, or they could have placed it at this intersection here. The network booster will affect the 4 network tiles around it. It's important to note that a player cannot place a network booster in a space already containing a network booster, and a player would be unable to place a network booster in a way that would cause it to hang off of any tiles. The next action a player could take on their turn would be to install a virus. You can only have one active virus on each other player. To install a virus, a player would have to spend 3 credits from their bank. They would then choose a network tile of an opponent to place one of their virus tokens on. It's important to note that the targeted tile has to be affected by either an informant or a network booster, and the tile can't have a neutralized virus or a destruction token on it. So for instance, the white player could pay 3 credits to place a virus token on this network tile. Alternatively, on their turn, a player could also pay 3 credits to relocate an active virus from one tile to a different tile in an opponent's network. The same placement restrictions apply. So for instance, if the white player wanted to move their virus marker to a different location in this player's network, they would have to choose one of these 3 locations, as these are the only 3 that are affected by either a booster or an informant. Having an active virus on your opponent's network allows you to steal some of the information that's rewarded to that player during the transmission phase. Let's say, for instance, that a 4 was rolled during the transmission phase. Normally, this player would receive 3 yellow information cubes, 1 for the rolled tile, 1 for the informant, and 1 for the network booster that's affecting that tile. If an opponent controls an active virus, however, they receive half of the rewards rounded up. So for instance, in this example, this player would receive 3 information cubes, but the player who controls the active virus would receive 2 of those information cubes, half of the number rounded up. If a tile with an active virus is destroyed by a corporate attack, this virus token would be returned to the player who controls it. It's important to note that the only way to neutralize a virus is to use a contact matching the affected tile's color. So for instance, if the player had a yellow contact in their supply, they could at any point on their turn flip over the yellow contact to neutralize this virus. A neutralized virus no longer siphons information from this tile, and if a tile containing a neutralized virus is destroyed, that destroyed virus token doesn't go back to its owner. You would simply place the destruction token over that tile. Essentially, a neutralized virus tile never goes back to its owner. And finally, the last action that can be taken on a player's turn is to gain 1 credit. This is the only action that a player can perform twice in a row. After taking 2 actions, the player would then complete a trace phase. During the trace phase, the active player rolls any retaliation dice they've collected during their turn. If the retaliation dice roll equal to or greater than the number of trace tokens that are showing on the matching fences, then no retaliation occurs and the players can move on. If, however, the dice roll a number that is less than the current number of trace tokens on the fence, a retaliation will occur. If there are multiple fences where a retaliation would occur in a turn, only the fence showing the lowest number will suffer the retaliation. The other fence would be spared. If multiple dice are tied for the lowest number rolled, then each affected fence will suffer a retaliation. It's also important to note that if any fence has 6 trace tokens on it, they will automatically suffer a retaliation. When a fence suffers a retaliation, the players will remove as many information cubes from that fence as there are trace tokens. So for instance, this fence currently has 6 trace tokens. There are only 5 information cubes available, so the players would remove all 6 trace tokens, and then they would remove all 5 information cubes. If there are more trace tokens than information cubes, you simply remove all of the cubes. In the green fence example, there are only 2 trace tokens, so you would remove all of the trace tokens and then remove the 2 information cubes, matching the number of trace tokens. The first time a retaliation happens to a fence, the players will draw the top card from the response deck and place it next to the fence. In future retaliations, if there is a response card left, the players would first remove this response card from the game and then draw a new response card for this fence. Response cards will change the rules of how players will interact with the corresponding fence. So for instance, this response card says that the cost to buy information cubes from this fence is equal to the number of traces on this fence, not the value showing on the track. The players are required to pay at least 1 credit. These are the types of effects that these response cards will have on the different fences. Whenever a fence has a face-up response card next to it, the response card's rules will always take effect when players interact with this fence. After resolving any retaliations that may occur, the active player will return the retaliation dice to the corresponding fence, and it's then the next player's turn in clockwise order. If during a retaliation a player needs to draw a response card to replace a previously placed response card and they're unable to, the game end condition has been met. Each player who hasn't had a chance to take a turn this round will take a turn, and then the game ends and scoring will occur. Players will score points based on a number of different things they might have achieved throughout the game. When calculating in-game scoring, players can use the reference on their player guide to keep track. Players will first score points for their contacts. 2 acquired contacts are worth 10 points, as you can see from the top left reference. It's important to note that each used contact is worth -1 reputation, but still counts in your total contact count for scoring. So for instance, this contact will -1 point from this player, but it will still count as one of the 2 contacts for scoring for a total of 10 points. Depending on how many network boosters have been placed, players will also score points. In this example, this player has placed 2 network boosters, and that equals 16 total points. Players will also score points for their informants. In our example, the player has placed 3 out of their 4 informants for a total of 17 points. Players will also score points for their credits. To get the number of points scored for credits, players will take their total number of credits and divide it by 3, rounded down. So for instance, this player has 8 credits, which means they would get 2 points. 8 divided by 3, rounded down. Next, a player would score a point for each intact network extension they'd installed into their network. So for instance, this player installed 2 extra network extension tiles, which means they would get 2 points. It's important to note that if a network extension tile has a destruction token on it, it is not used for scoring, and a destruction tile on a token counts as a negative point at the end of the game. If there's an active virus token on one of your tiles, the active virus token counts as -1 point. A neutralized virus tile will not count as a negative point. After scoring all of these categories, the player who has the highest valued reputation is the winner. If there's a tie, the player with the most information cubes remaining is the winner, and if there's still a tie, the player with the highest valued information cubes, according to the fences, will win. Now that we've looked at how to play the game in detail, let's take one example turn so that you can see the flow of how a turn works. Let's say that this player was taking a turn. The first step is the transmission phase. This player would roll the 2 transmission dice. A 9 was rolled. This means that the white player would gain a green information cube for the 9 in their network, and this player would gain 5 red information cubes, 1 for the rolled number, and then 1 for each of the informants and network boosters affecting that tile. The first action this player decides to take is to trade in these 3 red information cubes to make a contact with the red contact here. Since the player interacted with the red fence and the retaliation die is still showing, they would take the red retaliation die and place a trace token on the red fence. Next, this player decides that they want to buy some cubes from the blue fence. Since the visible number shows a 1, each blue information cube purchased would cost 1 credit. This player decides to buy 6, as that would give them plenty of information that they could use to take actions on future turns. The player would pay 6 credits, down to 2, and then take the 6 blue information cubes from that fence. Since the fence they interacted with still has the retaliation die, They would take the retaliation die and place a trace token on that fence. Now that the player has taken the 2 actions for their turn, they will roll the 2 retaliation dice they've collected on their turn. Red has rolled a 1, and blue has rolled a 5. So since blue has rolled a number that's greater than the number of trace tokens, no retaliation will occur. Red, however, is going to suffer a retaliation because 1 is less than the 2 trace tokens showing. Both trace tokens would be removed, and 2 information cubes would be removed from this fence as well, since there were 2 trace tokens. Then a response card from the deck would be placed next to this fence, and it will modify how players will interact with this fence on their turn. After returning the retaliation dice that the player rolled, this player's turn is over, and it would move to the next player's turn. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful, and we hope that it was informative. If you still have any questions about how to play the game, please comment below or email us directly at thedicey@gmail.com. If you want to hear more from the Dicey Review, you can listen to our Dicey Review podcast. It can be found on iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, SoundCloud, and pretty much any podcasting app. You can read our written reviews at thedicey.review.com, and make sure and connect with us on social media or at our Board Game Geek Guild. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, we'll see you at the table.